They called some of these prisons tinderboxes, places where violence could ignite at any moment. And when they did, the aftermath was nothing short of catastrophic. In this video, we're diving into 7 of the deadliest prison gang riots to ever shake the United States. Lee Correctional Institution, built back in 1993, houses more than 1,500 inmates, most locked up for violent crimes. It's one of South Carolina's biggest maximum security prisons, split into 2 yards, east and west. The east yard is where things are calmer, with a character-based dorm that gives inmates a little more freedom. But over in the west yard, in units like F1, F3, and F5, the atmosphere is much more dangerous. Inside Lee, 3 gangs dominate the scene: the Bloods, the Gangster Disciples, and the Crips. The Bloods hold the numbers, which often forces the Disciples and Crips to team up just to keep balance. Over the years, the prison gained a reputation for violence. Stabbings, riots, and hostage standoffs became part of its history. Attorney J. Edward Bell, who represents hundreds of inmates claiming abuse or threats inside South Carolina prisons, once called Lee a tinderbox. He wasn't exaggerating. With overcrowding, low staffing, and broken systems, it was only a matter of time before things exploded. On April 15, 2018, that fuse lit. Around 7 p.m., the deadliest prison riot in decades broke out inside Lee. It started inside the cell of Michael Millage, a senior inmate known for smuggling in contraband. Millage, who had only been transferred there a few months earlier, was attacked by DeMonte Rivera, a gangster disciple from McCormick Prison. Rivera slipped into his open cell and stabbed him repeatedly. Millage's blood allies struck back immediately, and just like that, a gang beef turned into a prison-wide war. Inmates armed themselves with homemade blades, some trying to cover their faces from cameras, others running for safety that didn't exist. The guards on duty were outnumbered, each one overseeing hundreds of men with no real protection. They couldn't stop the violence, and backup was hours away. By 7:30 p.m., a group of inmates tried to hold the door shut to keep marauders out of their unit, but it didn't hold. Those trying to defend their brothers were stabbed over and over as the attackers forced their way in. 15 minutes later, prison officials activated tactical teams, but for the guards already inside, there was nothing to do but wait. They did manage to save a female officer trapped inside the chaos, pulling her out before it was too late. With no real help coming, inmates turned to contraband phones to call 911. One desperate voice begged for rescue, saying attackers were right outside his door trying to break through. But policies and understaffing crippled any quick medical response. Even when paramedics tried to move the badly injured Millage, staff shortages made it nearly impossible. The violence stretched on for hours. Some inmates tried to escape, some climbed fences, while others were cut down in the attempt. Bodies piled up, blood filled the walkways, and those still alive begged for help that never came. It wasn't until after 11:30 p.m., more than 3 hours later, that the first tactical team entered a dorm. By 3 a.m., the prison was finally back under control. 7 men were dead, dozens more injured. It was the deadliest prison riot since the 1993 uprising in Ohio. Many wondered why it took so long for officers to step in, especially since no hostages were taken. Inmates described the scene as pure horror, with bodies stacked like wood and injured men left to bleed out because the gates stayed locked. Some swore their fellow prisoners might have survived if guards had simply opened doors and let others drag them to safety. State officials defended their response, saying teams entered as soon as it was safe for staff. But critics weren't buying it. Attorney Jerry Bell had been warning for years that gangs were running the prisons, not the guards. Back in 2012, Lee inmates had taken over parts of the facility twice, coordinating their moves with smuggled phones. Even then, Governor Nikki Haley had called Lee one of the most dangerous prisons in the state. The aftermath brought more finger-pointing. Corrections. Director Brian Sterling blamed it on turf wars and contraband, mainly cell phones, since those phones let inmates keep running things like they were still on the streets. He pushed hard for laws to cut off cell signals in prisons, and Governor Henry McMaster was right there backing him. But Representative Justin Bamberg wasn't having it. He clapped back, saying the real problem was leadership. In his words, 7 men don't just end up butchered unless somebody at the top seriously dropped the ball. When it was all over, officials shipped nearly 50 inmates off to a private prison in Mississippi. And soon after, indictments started dropping. Murder, conspiracy, mob assault, the whole lineup. July 27, 1973. That was the day Oklahoma's Big Mac stopped being just another prison and turned into straight up hell on earth. The joint lit up with fire, smoke, stabbings, beatings, and looting. But honestly, if you look at what was happening before that day, you could see it coming. Earlier that year, the inmates had already staged a 3-day hunger strike. They were tired of bad health care, racist treatment, and even having their mail censored. Violence was nothing new either. 19 inmates killed and 40 stabbed in just 3 years. Big Mac was already a powder keg, and on that afternoon, it finally blew. It all kicked off in the mess hall around 2:30 p.m. 2 officers, Captain C.C. Smith and Lieutenant Thomas Payne, got stabbed. When other prison officials tried to help, they got jumped by a group of inmates and became the first hostages. In no time, 21 staff members were in the hands of prisoners. By 4:30, the first inmate death went down. Elwoodrow Lee Brooks got stabbed and beaten by his own. An hour later, inmates stormed the hospital, and before 6 o'clock, the whole place was on fire. Inside all this madness was Lionel Johnson, a prison employee who'd been supervising inmate cooks for 2 years. He was used to the everyday tension, but that day was different. He stepped out, saw inmates running wild, drunk off homemade liquor, armed with long knives, and stabbing officers. One of them put a butcher knife to his throat, dragging him off with other staff into a cell. But instead of being brutalized, Johnson's friends among the inmates looked out for him. In his words, it wasn't really being held hostage. It was more like being protected. Meanwhile, outside the walls, McAllister police officer Dale Nave was just clocking out, ready to go home when he got called in. He rolled up and saw fire and smoke pouring out of the prison. His squad, outnumbered and outgunned, had one mission: keep the inmates from spilling into the streets until backup came. And backup did come. Hundreds of National Guard troops and officers from all over Oklahoma rolled in, dogs and all, prepared to storm the place. On the inside, inmates set buildings ablaze and used the PA system to announce a revolution. On the outside, cops and guards could only guess what was going down. As the smoke rose, inmate leaders like Marvin Gibson stepped forward. Serving 2 life sentences, Gibson told reporters the staff had zero respect for them, saying they just wanted to be treated like men, not animals. He denied that drugs or race played a role in the riot, but he made it clear overcrowding, brutal guards, no programs, and a sadistic medical system pushed things to the breaking point. The inmates made their demands: media access, a sit-down with Governor David Hall, and even full amnesty for the riot leaders. And surprisingly, the hostages came out unharmed. Many inmates were actually stabbed by their own just to keep the guards safe. When the press was finally allowed in, convicts were so desperate to be heard, they were grabbing reporters and shouting about the cruelty inside Oklahoma's prison system. Outside, tension stayed high. Around 2,000 officers and guards were ready to move if the prisoners made one wrong move. McAllister police had their own plan too. If the inmates broke through the east gate, they were ready to gun them down before they reached the streets. That moment never came though. The prisoners stayed behind the walls the whole time. The riot dragged on for days. By the time it ended on August 4th, 24 buildings were gone, $22 million worth of destruction was done, and 35 people were injured, including Correctional Officer John Barrier, who took the worst of it. When the smoke cleared, experts called it the most destructive prison riot in American history. Governor Hall brought in a consultant who said flat out that the place should be torn down. Lawsuits piled up too, like Bobby Battle's case that exposed how conditions violated the Constitution. But instead of bulldozing Big Mac, Oklahoma rebuilt it into the Supermax prison it is today. Pelican Bay had a certain weight to it, even before anyone walked through the gates. The prison sat on 270 acres near the Oregon border, nothing but gray concrete, gun towers, and miles of razor wire cutting into the horizon. No trees, no warmth, just cold steel and stone. The layout looked like something out of a war zone, 8 cell blocks stretching out from a 3-acre yard, shaped like the spokes of a wheel. When it opened in 1989, it was built for 2,280 men, but by 2000, the count had already blown past 3,000. The type of men locked inside made the place even heavier. These weren't small-time hustlers or low-level offenders. This was California's most violent. Many had already been problems in other prisons. Shot callers from different gangs walked the yard, their word moving through networks that stretched far beyond the walls. For guards, that meant living with a constant recipe for racial wars, ready to boil over. The tension had already cracked a few months earlier, when a fight between black and white inmates ended with a guard's cheekbone fractured. By February 2000, everybody inside felt the storm coming. Social service workers visiting the facility described guards moving around in Kevlar vests, tear gas locked and loaded, the air so thick with tension, it seemed like war was only a matter of time. That time came on February 23rd, 2000. A rainy, heavy morning set the scene. Around 9 a.m., Facility B's yard opened, and about 150 to 200 men stepped outside. At first, things seemed calm, but within 30 minutes, everything snapped. A fight broke out between black and Latino inmates, and in minutes, nearly 200 men were locked in a full-blown riot. Only 15 to 20 guards were nearby when it started, and they were quickly overwhelmed. Orders to stop went ignored. Tear gas and pepper spray came first, then rubber and wooden bullets. None of it slowed the chaos. Finally, the Ruger Mini 14 rifles came out. Guards fired off 24 live rounds into the yard. Even then, it took 120 officers almost half an hour to crush the riot. When it was over, the yard looked like a battlefield. 13 men had been shot, 19 more were stabbed, slashed, or beaten with handmade weapons. In total, 28 inmates were sent to hospitals. Miguel Sanchez, a 38-year-old serving 25 to life for murder out of Los Angeles, didn't survive. 2 others barely clung to life, one left torn apart by a shotgun blast. The investigation revealed the scale of what had unfolded. Officers recovered 89 homemade weapons, everything from sharpened pens to spear-like rods powered by strips of underwear. Some were brutal enough to be called bone crushers, able to pierce flesh and snap bone. Reporters allowed into the aftermath saw the carnage firsthand. Raincoats soaked in blood, shredded jeans, and light blue prison shirts scattered across the grass like remnants of a war. Authorities immediately turned to security footage to piece things together, focusing especially on the 2 guards who had fired 24 live rounds. The rules on deadly force had been tightened in 1998, and while officials admitted the violence seemed to justify the response, an investigation was still mandatory. The footage of Sanchez being shot was described as disturbing, and the 2 guards involved were placed on administrative leave. Not everyone questioned them. Leaders from the Correctional Officers Union backed the guards without hesitation, saying their actions saved lives and that without deadly force, the body count would have been much higher. What threw many off was the matchup itself. Everyone had expected black and white inmates to clash since their beef had been simmering for months. Instead, it was black and Latino inmates tearing into each other, something Pelican Bay hadn't seen on such a scale since the early 90s. Staff admitted privately that, given the atmosphere, no one should have been surprised at how far things went. But inmates told a different story. A report from California Prison Focus, based on interviews with 50 prisoners, claimed the guards might have fueled the fire. Some men said guards gave them strange warnings before yard time, one even recalling an officer telling him to do whatever you're going to do today because tomorrow we're on lockdown. Another claimed a guard smirked and told him it was his lucky day. What made those claims harder to dismiss was the weapon count. If every inmate was searched before stepping outside, how did 89 weapons slip through? Many prisoners swore the searches that morning were unusually light, almost like somebody wanted the storm to hit. Lucasville, Ohio, carries a name tied to one of the most violent uprisings in U.S. prison history. It all went down on Easter Sunday in 1993, inside the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. On a day meant for peace and worship, more than 400 inmates took control of one of the prison's main cell blocks, sparking a siege that dragged on for 11 long days. The tension had been building for a while. A new warden had recently tightened the movement rules. The prison was jam-packed way beyond capacity, and Muslim inmates were outraged over tuberculosis tests that contained alcohol, which clashed with their religious beliefs. Add to that the lingering pressure from a brutal 1990 murder inside the prison when an inmate, Eddie Vaughn, killed a female tutor named Beverly Taylor, and the whole place was like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Reggie Wilkinson, who led Ohio's Department of Corrections, later explained it wasn't just one issue. It was the crowding, the new rules, the TB tests, and the fact that the prison had been built more like a medium security facility, but was housing dangerous, high-risk inmates. According to the state, 3 groups in particular, the Black Gangster Disciples, the Muslims, and the Aryan Brotherhood, were at the heart of the uprising. On April 11th and 12th, chaos erupted. Inmates fought each other, killed at least 5 fellow prisoners, and took 8 guards hostage. The bodies of the dead were returned after hours of violence, showing clear signs of beatings. Prisoners didn't have guns, but they turned guards' batons into weapons. By April 15th, the standoff had taken a darker turn. Guard Robert Vallandigham was found dead, making him the first corrections officer killed during the siege. Meanwhile, inmates hung a sheet from a window threatening to kill more hostages if their demands weren't met. They wanted the warden fired, more black guards hired, and day-to-day rules relaxed. They also demanded the chance to speak directly to the media, even going so far as to request live TV time. Negotiations went back and forth. At one point, an inmate who called himself George went on the radio, declaring that prisoners were prepared to die if things didn't go their way. He denied that the riot was racially motivated, saying black and white inmates had united inside. Still, officials couldn't ignore the fact that most of the inmate victims were white, while one black inmate had also been killed. As days stretched into a week, the National Guard was called in to secure the perimeter. Food and medicine were sent in as good faith gestures, and eventually a hostage was released in exchange for broadcast time. But with 6 guards still trapped inside and tensions running high, the pressure was immense. Finally, on April 22nd, after 11 days, the inmates surrendered. 8 people had been killed, countless others injured, and the prison lay in ruins. Reporters who entered afterward described scenes of destruction, personal belongings trashed, walls marked with chilling words like convict unity, and an overwhelming sense of the chaos that had consumed the facility. In the aftermath, 48 inmates were convicted for crimes tied to the riot. 5 of them, later known as the Lucasville 5, were sentenced to death. They've long claimed their innocence, arguing that the state relied on shaky testimony from inmates who cut deals to save themselves. Even prosecutor Mark Piepmeyer admitted that some guilty men walked free while others took the fall. It was just before 10 a.m. when Pontiac Correctional Center flipped from routine to all-out war. About 550 inmates were heading back inside after yard time when the first sparks lit. At the same moment, another 600 men poured out of the auditorium where they had been watching a movie. They rushed into the courtyard, and that's when the whole place exploded. Gang members came armed, swinging homemade shanks and charging straight at the guards. State Corrections Director Charles P. Rowe later said nearly 200 inmates were fully caught up in the madness. Fires tore through the place. The laundry and clothing rooms burned down. The commissary was trashed, and even the North Cell House got wrecked. Investigators later blamed the whole thing on prison gangs, saying they wanted to test Warden Thaddeus Pinckney's grip on the joint. When local and state police rolled up, they fired tear gas into the yard, but that only seemed to make things hotter. Inmates answered back by torching more buildings, turning the courtyard into pure chaos. Only when reinforcements kept pouring in did the riot finally start to run out of steam. From his spot in Tower 9, Correctional Officer Tom Bailey had a front row view of the madness. Outside the walls, state police cars lined the streets. Inside, wounded staff were dragged to his post, which had become a safe zone. 3 guards were already badly hurt: Sharon Patchett, Dale Walker, and Danny Dill. By the time the smoke cleared, Pontiac looked like a battlefield. 3 correctional officers, Lieutenant William Thomas, age 49, Robert Conkle, just 22, and Stanley Cole, 47, were dead. Dill was fighting for his life at a hospital in Peoria, while Patchett and Walker were still hanging on, both badly wounded. The inmates involved were stripped, searched, and shoved back into their cells. Later reports revealed that only half the guards scheduled that day had even shown up for duty. Survivors painted grim pictures. One officer recalled being trapped in the kitchen, forced to hide inside a freezer just to escape the burning tear gas. Governor James R. Thompson pointed the finger at overcrowding and the brutal summer heat. Pontiac had been built to hold 600 men, but at the time it was crammed with more than 2,000. Officials claimed there had been no warning signs, though a fight the night before suggested trouble was already bubbling. The yard itself was run by gangs, gangster disciples, vice lords, and Latin kings, with Larry Hoover pulling strings from inside. Investigators later said Hoover convinced rival crews to put aside their beef and turn their firepower on the administration. When the grounds were swept after the riot, officers dug up knives and shanks buried where inmates had been forced down. Only tear gas had been fired by police, but the stabbing deaths of the 3 officers remained unsolved. Nobody talked, and the code of silence locked the investigation tight. The very next morning, reality hit hard. Breakfast was nothing but a box of milk and cold cereal. The food stores had gone up in flames. The prison went into a brutal deadlock that lasted until mid-October. Inmates were sealed in their cells 24/7. No showers, no yard, no jobs, no visits, no calls. Family visits didn't come back until October 14th, and phones weren't working again until the end of September. Prisoners filed complaints saying the conditions were breaking them down mentally and physically. Eventually, the courts forced the prison to ease up and bring back visits, phone calls, meals, exercise, and work programs. From then on, Pontiac changed the rules. Inmates could only move in small groups, single file, under tight watch. Even decades later, the shadow of that 1978 riot still hung heavy over Pontiac. By the late 1990s, maximum security prisoners were basically locked down around the clock, only let out for short yard time, showers, visits, or the law library. By 2008, things loosened up again. General population inmates had more freedom. They could work jobs, hit the gym, or spend time in the yard. Protective custody prisoners could get jobs as porters or maintenance workers, and some even joined the prison choir. When a helicopter dropped low over Attica prison on September 13th, 1971, many of the inmates thought their moment had come. After 5 days of holding out, they believed Governor Nelson Rockefeller had finally arrived to negotiate. Instead of a politician stepping forward, canisters of gas rained from the sky. The mix of CS and CN chemicals filled the air like a poisonous fog, burning eyes, choking lungs, and forcing men to their knees. That wasn't the end, it was only the start. What followed was an assault meant not just to take control, but to break spirits, leaving behind a trail of death, scars, and memories that would last for decades. Attica didn't explode overnight, it had been simmering for years. The prison was overcrowded, the food barely edible, and medical care almost non-existent. Located in western New York, it was a maximum security facility that housed infamous names like David, son of Sam Berkowitz, and Mark David Chapman, John Lennon's killer. The guards weren't seasoned professionals either. Most were just local men chasing steady paychecks. Undertrained, underpaid, and stretched thin, sometimes one officer for over 100 inmates. Many had to work side jobs just to get by. By the summer of 1971, inmates had had enough. A group calling themselves the Attica Liberation Faction drafted 28 demands, pushing for better food, medical care, and basic dignity. The state's response was to crack down harder. Anyone caught with the letter got thrown into solitary for 60 days, and conditions only tightened. But something was shifting behind the walls. Where race and religion had once divided men, unity started to form. After a prisoner was killed in California on August 21st, Attica's inmates honored him with silence, black armbands, and a quiet breakfast. The guards noticed. Some grew uneasy, even telling their families something didn't feel right. A few stopped carrying wallets to work, fearing they might not make it home. That tension snapped on September 9th. The day before, inmates had watched one of their own dragged from his cell. The next morning, as prisoners crowded a tunnel on their way back from breakfast, a lock clicked and panic flared. Believing an attack was coming, men lashed out, fists flew, glass shattered, and guards were stripped of their weapons. In the chaos, Officer William Quinn was struck in the head and later died from his injuries. Yet, not all inmates sought revenge. Some shielded guards who had treated them fairly. One officer, G.B. Smith, was saved when a prisoner pulled him from the mob and claimed him as his hostage. By the end of that morning, over 30 guards were being held hostage in the yard, and Attica was in the hands of the men who had been silenced too long. For 4 days, negotiations carried on. Big names like attorney William Kunstler and journalist Tom Wicker stepped in to mediate. But Rockefeller refused to set foot in the prison, even as prisoners pressed for amnesty and reforms. With a guard dead, the state's patience wore thin. On the 5th day, Rockefeller, with President Nixon's backing, ordered the prison retaken by force. About 550 state troopers and other law enforcement swarmed in, many carrying personal weapons, some ripping off identification to avoid accountability. Armed with rifles and soft-point bullets banned in war, they were told to pick a target and shoot to kill. After the gas dropped from the helicopter, gunfire erupted. Within 30 minutes, the prison was back under state control, but the bloodshed was staggering. 128 men shot, 29 prisoners dead, and 9 hostages killed. The violence didn't stop with the gunfire. Surviving inmates were stripped naked, forced to crawl through glass, beaten with rifle butts, and mocked as officers shoved guns in their mouths. Some were made to play Russian roulette or drink urine. Medical care was denied, and even doctors joined in the cruelty, laughing at wounded men and refusing treatment. Black prisoners reported racial slurs echoing across the yard, while they were brutalized. The state tried to cover it up. Early news reports blamed the dead hostages on the prisoners, not the police. Rockefeller called the operation a success, and much of the public accepted the lie. But when the truth surfaced, protests spread nationwide, and Attica became a symbol of state violence and betrayal. Investigations dragged on for years, with police harassing survivors and pushing them to testify against each other. By 1976, Governor Hugh Carey ended the legal mess by granting clemency to everyone connected to the riot. Decades later, in 2000, a group of survivors finally won a $12 million settlement. The judge issued a 200-page summary that laid bare the brutality and exposed the lies. But New York never admitted wrongdoing. For the men of Attica, the money wasn't the real victory. What mattered was finally having their truth written into history. Gary Nelson was locked up in a high-security prison in New Mexico, doing time for bank robbery. It was February 1980, and he was just hanging out with another inmate, sipping on some homemade moonshine. Out of nowhere, his cellmate got hyped, telling him, "When they come to count and that door swings open, we're taking over." Nelson brushed it off, not realizing that was exactly how things would unfold. The routine was always the same. Two officers would step into the dorm for the count, while another locked the door from outside. The day room, sitting about 60 feet down, had to be cleared and the TV turned off before the count could even start. Because the prison was overcrowded, the officers had to walk the center aisle, peeking down rows of single bunks to make sure heads lined up. This night, though, the shift commander tagged along. When he entered, the officer outside forgot to latch the door. That mistake cracked the whole prison wide open. At 1:40 a.m., two inmates in Dorm E2 made their move. They snatched up an officer before he could slam the door, took 4 guards hostage, and busted out. They quickly overwhelmed more officers trying to shut down the south end. If the grill to the south wing had been locked, the uprising might have been crushed right there, but it wasn't. Meanwhile, officers Larry Mendoza and Antonio Vigil were grabbing food in the mess hall when they spotted something off. An inmate dressed in an officer's uniform standing guard at the grill. Behind him, waves of prisoners surged forward. Mendoza and Vigil sprinted to the control center to warn everyone. The north grill by the control room was also left open, so the two officers ducked into the north wing just in time before it was slammed shut. By 2:05 a.m., the prison was theirs. Inmates shattered the supposedly bulletproof glass of the control center with a fire extinguisher and stormed inside. They got control of the locks and keys but didn't know how to run the system, so they had to open cell houses 1, 2, and 6 by hand. That's when the violence started to spiral. Two gangs steered the madness. The Chicanos stuck together, handling their own grudges, while the Aryan Brotherhood went straight for Cell Block 4. That block held 96 men, informants, mentally ill inmates, sex offenders, and others seen as weak. To the rioters, it was the snitch unit, but before they reached Block 4, inmates raided the psychology wing. They found stashes of drugs, filled shoeboxes with pills, and passed them around. Then they set the office on fire to wipe out parole records. With drugs fueling them, they pressed forward. Cell Block 4 didn't open easily, no keys, so they grabbed blowtorches from construction supplies in Cell Block 5 and spent 5 hours cutting through steel grills. While they worked, others raided the records office, hunting files that exposed who was informing. Over the walkie-talkies, they sent chilling threats, what they planned to do to the men trapped inside. Guards and state police outside listened, but did nothing. There was even a back door to the block that could have saved those men, but no keys were available. Officials agreed to stand down as long as the hostages stayed alive. By sunrise, an execution squad had cut inside. With the control panel smashed, they opened cells one by one using blowtorches. Victims were dragged out, tortured, mutilated, hanged, or burned alive. By 10 a.m., 12 were dead. 16 in total were killed in Block 4 before noon. The horror stories piled up. One witness recalled seeing a man's face burned with a blowtorch until his head exploded. Another inmate, Mario Riots, who had once been gang raped and later transferred to Block 4 for protection, was found hanged, his throat slit and his genitals stuffed in his mouth. Others were beaten with pipes, stabbed with shanks, or thrown from balconies and hacked apart. Fires lit up the prison. The gymnasium roof collapsed in flames. The Protestant chapel burned, and the records office was torched to destroy evidence tied to inmate lawsuits. Through it all, inmates used officers' radios to broadcast demands. The first message came at 1:57 a.m., sharp and political. They had the shift commander hostage and wanted the governor, the media, and Deputy Secretary Rodriguez to step in. It showed this wasn't just chaos, there was purpose behind the madness. By 2:30 a.m., negotiations began. Deputy Warden Robert Montoya led the talks, first over his car radio, then with a handheld. The inmates on the other side argued among themselves, with one calling himself Chopper One, claiming control. Governor Bruce King was alerted and Rodriguez arrived around 5 a.m. to take charge. The demands rolled in: overcrowding relief, due process, better conditions, and compliance with the Duran consent decree. Lonnie Duran, a known negotiator, became one of the inmate spokesmen. Their calls weren't just about survival, they wanted rights acknowledged. Inside, the hostages' fate varied. Some were protected by sympathetic inmates, fed and hidden. 2 officers even escaped disguised as prisoners. Others weren't so lucky, beaten and dealt with before being carried out by stretchers. By the afternoon, after hours of stalling and back and forth talks, the cops finally stormed in. What they walked into was straight up destruction. 33 inmates dead, more than 200 hurt, fires still burning, and the prison looking like a war zone. Later on, investigators said it all kicked off with just a small group, while most of the others were just trying to stay alive and get out of the chaos. But the numbers told it all. 33 lives lost, millions in damage, and scars that never healed for the people who went through it.